Uh, Thank you for joining us. My name is Carrie Fallhaber. I am a senior fellow with Jobs First NYC, and I'm so happy to welcome you today to part 2 of our Adapting to the Future of Work webinar series. This year's event forum series is called Transforming Systems to Advance Young Adult Economic Mobility. This Adapting to the Future of Work event series is a signature Jobs First forum, and we started it back in 2016 to really put a spotlight on the barriers that young adults face in accessing economic mobility and to work together to advance solutions that work. It previously has been an in-person event, but like all of you, we are adapting to new ways of working. I want to take a minute to go over some webinar logistics with you for this webinar. I'm sure you've joined a lot of them, so many of you are probably familiar with how Zoom works now, but I want you to know that we're recording this event, and following the event, we will clean up that recording and share it out with all of those of you who have attended. For this webinar also, we are enabling both the Q&A and the chat functions. They're both open. You can use either of them. But if you do have questions for any of our panelists, please make sure to use Q&A. You can find the Q&A button on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom. You see where the arrow is pointing on the slide. And post your questions there. If you see a question that you also want to ask, then hit the thumbs up to upvote it, and those questions will be posed to the panelists. And then the chat feature, that's really for you to just communicate with each other and share things that are not questions for our panelists today. And that can be found on the same bar on the bottom. That feature is there as well. And like I said, the Jobs First team will be monitoring both of these and will address things that come up in real time. On the top right, you'll see something that says View Options. And if you choose side-by-side mode, you'll see both our PowerPoint and our panelists, our guest speakers. And you could move that bar back and forth in the middle to make the slides bigger and to make the panelists' images larger. So if you want to see the slides, just slide that all the way over. And if you happen to be having any technical problems, please email Jessica Conway-Pierce, my colleague, and she will try to address those. Her email address is on the slide there. Today's conversation is really focusing on community-led solutions, and if you look at our agenda, you will see we have an amazing lineup of guests today who are going to share strategies that they have been and that they are supporting that really harness the power of communities, the power of people, to do more and to do better for young people and to do better for the communities that young people live in, and to do better for all of us. You can learn more about all of our guest speakers and their organizations from the information in the public folder. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. We'll do our best to pose them or respond to them. And again, thank you so much. We're really happy to have you joining this important conversation. It is now my pleasure to welcome Marjorie Parker, the President and CEO of Jobs First.
Marjorie, if you can go ahead and try to unmute yourself. We're having trouble unmuting you and starting your camera.
Okay.
You're on.
Tanisha? Oh, thank you so much. Let me repeat what I said at the beginning. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the second installment of Adapting to the Future of Work. And as you can see from the agenda, we have a great group of guest panelists who will be sharing their experiences with us today. I thought it would be useful before we get to our first panel for us to spend a few moments reflecting on why JobSearch NYC was launched and why now, with the impact of COVID-19 on young adult employment, working through community-led solutions will be even more critical for these young adults and the communities where they live. So in 2006, JobSearch NYC was funded out of a crisis. Then we had high numbers of young adults who were out of work and out of school. We were built through a community-led planning and design process. We like to say there was a meeting in all 5 boroughs, well, maybe in 4 boroughs except Staten Island. That included a wide range of stakeholders involved in the fight to connect these young adults to economic opportunities. Our mission then and now, as you see here, to create and advance new solutions that break down barriers and transform the systems supporting young adults and their communities in pursuit of economic opportunities. I want to bring your eye to these statistics right on the right side of your screen. In 2005, that was the year before we were launched, 19% of young adults 18 to 24 were out of work and out of school. In 2010, that number was 22%. If you remember, we had the Great Recession in 2008. In 2015, we began making inroads in those numbers. We're down to 136,000. I want you to jump forward to 2020. These are the COVID numbers. These numbers include 16 to 24-year-old. Because these young adults at this age group began showing up in our programs, the low estimate right now is 27%. The high estimate is 34%. But if that's not shocking by itself, I can pull an example out for you. For example, in the Bronx, prior to COVID-19, the average across that borough was about 19% of young people were out of work and out of school. We're looking at an astounding high of up to 41% right now. So clearly we have a lot of work ahead of us to do. Our vision remains the same here at JobSearch NYC. It's a dynamic, inclusive New York City that advances economic mobility for all young adults and the communities in which they live. The process of our founding is embedded in our approach to finding solutions. So we do everything through partnership. We were built through a partnership collaboration. These are some of our partners that we work with. All right, they're education institutions, they're employers, they're high schools, they're intermediaries, they're employers. We utilize a 5-step process across all of our work. And that process, we call it the 5 I's. And across the 5 I's, we aim to do 3 things: identify challenges, incubate new solutions, and advance what works. Those 5 I's are investigate, imagine, incubate, implement, and integrate. You can learn more about the process today when you hear from our partners, and you can learn more by visiting our website. And I want to just share with you here that our process is driven by our core values. These are the core values through which we were launched. People first. Humans and their potential are both the focus of our work. Bold ideas, breakthrough change won't come from doing what we've done before. Collective genius is what we need more than ever right now in COVID and all the other challenges that we have today, that we can do more together than we can do apart. This is not new. This is classic community organizing principle. And informed objectivity, more of what we need today. We set aside agendas. We listen before we act, and we focus on solutions. While the economic success of young adults is determined by numerous factors, we believe solutions should be sourced from diverse perspectives and experiences, and we focus on solutions through these 3 areas. Community, this is creating localized solutions. Communities may have the same demographic information, but each community is unique, and we approach our work that way. Education, we look at the institutions that are the biggest feeders to the out of school, out of work population, and we ask ourselves, can we help to stem the flow? Or can we help to stem the inflow of young adults coming into the out of school, out of work population? And work really identify and design and advance practices and policies that achieve better outcomes for employers and workers. These are 6 of our place-based community solutions partnerships. Today, you will hear from 5 of them. They will talk about how they work and creating localized solution that that responded to the unique needs of their communities. Finally, I want to say that we center our work around a repeatable credibility building process. Given the nature of our work, the solutions we're working on will never quite look the same. As I said before, each community is unique. What looks the same often is our process built and refined over the last 15 years. And that remains consistent and allows us to achieve measurable impact and measurable outcomes across each of the communities that we work with. So I want to thank you again for joining us this morning. I hope this next 2 hours will be fruitful and that you will learn some things you can take back to your own community. And now it's my pleasure to turn you over to Leanne Bennett. Leanne?
Hello, and thank you so much, Marjorie. It's my pleasure to be here today representing the Jobs First NYC's board, as well as an honor to be the moderator of our first panel here today. On our panel this afternoon, we have Lori Boozer, Senior Program Officer of Mobility Labs at Robin Hood. We have Faye Henley Brown, Managing Director at FSG. And we have Monique Miles, Vice President of the Aspen Institute. I want to welcome all of our panelists and thank you for being here. We look forward to hearing all about your experiences because this is such an incredibly important conversation we're having today. Even more relevant today with the overwhelming impact of COVID-19 on our under-resourced communities. Since Jobs First NYC's launch, we've been working on finding economic solutions through a collaborative partnership approach and heavily focused on place-based solutions as we work to advance economic opportunities for young adults and the communities where they live. So I want to start the questions because the time will be flying here with Monique, but I would also like to invite all the other panelists to chime in and build on any part of this conversation by just raising your hand so I can invite you in. But getting us started, Monique, at Aspen, the Opportunity Youth Forum, or OYF, was launched in 2012 across 21 cities to leverage the momentum of the Opportunity Youth movement, including the call for community-based solutions. We'd love for you to tell us a little bit about OYF and what you've learned along the way about how this initiative impacts youth economic well-being and what's working, what's not working. Monique.
Thank you for that question, Leanne. I want to actually kick it off by just formally thanking Marjorie, Carrie, Kevin, the entire team at Jobs First New York City for bringing together this important conversation today. Before I dive into your question, I just want to briefly just share with the audience our work at the Aspen Institute, mostly so that as I'm walking through my response, it will be contextualized in what it is that we aim to accomplish at the Forum for Community Solutions. So I'll just share quickly that our work started at the Aspen Institute approximately 8 years ago. We were born out of the White House Council for Community Solutions, and really what we aim to do, our overall mission is to promote collaborative community-based efforts that at their core are building power and influence with people who have the least access to opportunity and the least access to power. So our communities are supported to come together to expand mobility, eliminate systemic barriers, and create solutions to their most pressing challenges. Our vision is that going into the future, communities can create their vibrant and lasting solutions to social and economic challenges that they face, and really are well positioned to lead in terms of community power building and creating a more just and equitable society. The last thing that I want to say is particular to our values. Our work is founded most importantly in the values of equity and justice. We believe that so many of the challenges communities face are born out of the historical policies that have created disparate opportunities, particularly as it relates to structural racism and oppression. And so for us to really be rooted in equity and justice and ensuring that the people most impacted by our issues are at the center of problem identification and solution design are at the core of our work. And I'll just say briefly also about our work is that we are a national funders collaborative. We partner with national, regional, and local philanthropy in order to invest in solutions and system change. And at the same time, we take an ecosystem approach to addressing pressing challenges that communities face. The biggest issue we focused on today is opportunity youth, which, as we all know, are young people between ages of 16 to 24 who are out of school and out of work. And as Marjorie just pointed out to us, that number has grown exponentially since the impact of COVID. And so we are working through our community-based grantee partners to essentially build out a second chance system that is aimed at connecting young people to education and careers. And then if you wouldn't mind fast forwarding to the last slide, it's just important to frame that we are invested now in more than 30 communities in the United States. So 30 communities includes, again, rural, urban, and tribal communities that are coming together across systems and across sectors to build this second chance system for young people who are out of school and out of work. So your question was about economic well-being and what have we learned? So I think the most important piece to lift up in terms of response, my response is that we support communities to take an ecosystem approach to building out pathways for young people. What does that mean? That means that we are supporting young people in the communities that you see before you on this map to bring together the different systems that touch the lives of young people: secondary system, post-secondary system, justice system, foster care system, and really aligning on how they are designing programs so that young people can more seamlessly transition from secondary into post-secondary, from post-secondary into careers. And we are supporting these system partners to take that ecosystem lens to use data to design strategy, to use their strategy to inform a policy and advocacy agenda, and most critically, to center the voices of young people, families, and communities that really do have a vision around how to ensure that more young people, many more young people, are connected to opportunity. So I talked about pathways. For us, that ecosystem lens really means opportunities for young people to earn and learn so that young people are gaining the necessary, the requisite skills to advance in career pathways, while also gaining the education, skills, and training necessary to advance as well, while also, frankly, gaining enough money, experiencing employment in ways that help them sustain themselves, sustain their families, and also contribute to their community. The second piece that I would say that's been part of our work is supporting a policy and advocacy agenda so that communities, and most importantly, system leaders, are able to advocate and tap into public dollars, public revenue streams, so that the work that they're doing, the solutions that they're promoted, are able to be scaled and sustained. And the last piece that I want to say, what we have seen work really well is communities that have collaborative infrastructure and capacity, they're also able to be responsive in real time to some of the most pressing challenges that they face. COVID-19 is a great example of where we have seen deep resiliency in communities so that they're able to pivot and shift their strategies so that they're able to do things like rapid responsiveness, able to provide resources related to transportation, food security, housing, many of the challenges that especially impacted our most vulnerable young people and communities in the face of COVID-19. So having that infrastructure and capacity in place, having that ecosystem lens, able to focus on policy and advocacy to leverage public dollars as well as connect into private dollars as well, so that communities can be responsive to the real-time moment that they're facing and pivot their strategy in order to create better access to opportunity for young people. All of this at its core is tied to how communities have built out economic well-being, because all of these issues intersect, whether it's housing, whether it's education, they intersect to either promote opportunities for young people or create barriers. Communities that have done the economic well-being piece really well are able to meaningfully intersect each of these pieces within ecosystem lens in order to create opportunities for young adults in our country. And I'll stop there.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's a great story, and it's all about agility and all the other key elements you raised. I'd like to turn it to Lori now. Mobility Learning and Action Bets, or Mobility Labs for short, is a pioneering 4-year initiative to spur the development of new solutions through a place-based community solutions approach. So tell us more about Mobility Labs, Lori, and why Robin Hood and its philanthropic partners have decided on this approach to economic mobility. Lori.
Certainly. Thank you, Leanne, and thank you to Marjorie and Carrie for having me on this panel. I most certainly also have to thank my team that I know is logged in and watching. So Kathy Garcia, Stephanie Rameau, Emery Aronson, and Razak Abdul Rahman. Just want to thank them because without them, I think this work just would not happen in the way that it's been able to happen. I want to start by saying that the reason why this first slide says that economic mobility is a journey and not a destination is in part because I think one of the things we recognize is we have had this tendency to fund one-off programs and initiatives without thinking about the holistic needs of an individual and the shocks on a person's journey along the way out of poverty. And so a part of what Mobility Labs is looking to do is to look at what those shocks are and how we overcome them and how we promote sustainable and measurable economic mobility. Before I go into more detail about labs, what I want to say very quickly about Robin Hood as an organization is that we've been fighting poverty in New York City for the last 30 years, so 3 decades worth of funding, amazing, extraordinary programs. Many of you who may be on this call, organizations doing great work, brilliant work on the front lines. And that work remains and continues to be important to Robin Hood. I think the one thing that we always hear our CEO talk about is, you know, the $3 billion or so that Robin Hood has given over the last 30 years really has had an impact, but that we don't see the type of change and the shift in poverty that we would like to see. We don't see individuals being able to move not just out of poverty, but stay out of poverty. So you can go to the next slide. And I think that when we thought about Mobility Labs and what this work was going to look like, it is just that, it's a lab, learning and action bets, because we knew that as a philanthropic body, we didn't necessarily have all the answers and we needed to learn and we needed to take some risks and be innovative in our approach. And so what we set out to do was give a series of grants, both planning grants and implementation grants over the course of 4 years to really partner with local communities and help identify sort of what the needs were and what the solutions could be. I think the thing that we have had the tendency to do is, you know, fund organizations and not necessarily, to what Monique said earlier, empower communities to really be a part of the decision-making process. So we launched officially at no city limits in 2019, you know, with a full discussion around economic mobility and the recognition by Robin Hood and by West that as an organization, we needed to think differently about how we were approaching this work. Our former managing director, Nisha Patel, had done some work with the U.S. Partnership on Mobility. And, you know, there were sort of these 3 variables around mobility that we thought it would be important to explore. So we know that economic mobility is important. We also wanted to look at power and autonomy and belonging and inclusion, and to really get a sense from the community as we work in partnership and in tandem, how exactly do these variables fit together. You can skip to the triangle slides. And so this work is currently taking place across 9 communities in the country. It's the first national initiative for Robin Hood. So we have 3 communities here in New York City, 3 communities in California, and 1 community each in Baltimore, Chicago, and Northeast Pennsylvania. And so what you're looking at here, I think, is just sort of a graphic representation of why we've decided it's important to rethink how we do this work. Traditionally, we've worked in a space where everything has been done to community and for the community without any real agency. And I think if you go to the next slide, what we recognize is that the most stable way to engage with community is to allow community to really drive the work from the ground up. And so how do we partner with community? How do we have proximity? How do we look at history? How do we look at all the variables and really think deliberately and strategically from the bottom up with what the solutions need to be in order to create measurable and sustainable movement out of poverty? And so the last thing I'll say very quickly is that, you know, obviously our focus is on ages, families with children 18 and under, and then also young adults ages 14 to 24, but that essentially the acknowledgement that community voice, in addition to what Robin Hood is strongly known for, which is that very metrics driven approach to grant making, that we need to hear more from people on the ground. And at the No City Limits conference in 2019, I think one of the standout moments was a presentation from Raj Chetty, which is one of our technical assistance partners, where he talked about a street in Brownsville where on one side of the street there was a different economic outcome than the other side of the street. And I actually got a chance to take this team to that street to be able to see the difference. And on one side, what you saw was a NYCHA public housing development. And on the other side, what you saw was a set of Nehemiah houses that had been built and constructed. And so looking at things like that and having those conversations with community, I think is at the crux and core of what we're looking to do with Mobility Labs to change outcomes.
Wow, powerful work. And those graphics just really spoke to me around how shifting from what doing to and for a community, and rather than the new shift to bringing them in and inviting them to participate in the solutions. I love it. So just a quick note to everybody, remind you, if you have questions, put them in the chat, we'll get to them. But before that, I want to go to Faye. Faye, FSG's collective impact approach is now well known for organizing communities to address large-scale social, economic, and environmental problems and affecting systems change. Can you tell us a little bit about why finding solutions through a place-based collective impact approach, bringing people together in an unstructured way, is more effective? And if I can tack on, from FSG's intermediary perspective, how does this collaborative approach contribute to systems change?
Thanks so much, Leanne. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank Marjorie and Carrie and the team as well for having me on. And just to say, I am a huge fan of Lori and Monique and the amazing work of your organization. So it's just a pleasure to be on this panel. I have been working deeply in FSG's collective impact work over the last decade or so. And that, of course, includes our partner Monique team at Aspen on the Collective Impact Forum, which I certainly encourage folks to check out. It's an amazing global community around collective impact and also has a lot of free resources that people can access. And I also at FSG worked very deeply in our economic mobility work, which is really focused on increasing economic mobility specifically for people that work in frontline jobs. And in particular for women and people of color who are disproportionately represented in those jobs. And the way that we do that at FSG is really to work with employers to shift employer mindsets and to shift employer practices and culture towards that end. And I would say, just sort of to get back to your question about collective impact, Leanne, FSG may have coined the term collective impact, but clearly we did not invent the practice of cross-sector community collaboration. That has been going on for decades and decades. And when my colleagues John and Mark wrote the original collective impact article now about a decade ago in Stanford Social Innovation Review, I think it touched a nerve in the field. And what we heard from the field was that it was helpful just because it provided a frame, a common language for cross-sector partners in community to talk to one another about what is very complex, very messy systems work. And it's also created a learning community that allows communities to learn across as well. So that's something that we've really been excited to see. There has also been some good research in the last couple of years that really look at the components of collective impact, and sort of when you unpack them, we can see that having that cross-sector collaboration at the community level really can lead to systems as well as to the ultimate outcomes for populations, which is what we all want. And so for the academic folks in our audience today, there's a report called When Collective Impact Has an Impact, which was published by ORS and Spark Policy. I think that, maybe we can put that in the link for folks to access, but just gets into some of the methodology for what we've seen in terms of impact there. But I think it's really worth noting, as Monique mentioned, that what we're seeing now is that communities that have collective impact in place, or really cross-sector collaboratives in place, are better positioned to respond to crises. And what we're seeing now, of course, is a triple crisis. We are seeing the crisis of the global health pandemic. We are seeing the crisis of the prolonged economic downturn that we are now coming into, and we're seeing the crisis of anti-Black racism. And those three crises are happening simultaneously. And what we're seeing is that communities that have that collaborative infrastructure in place, that have those relationships in place, are able to respond much more quickly and comprehensively to this triple crisis. I think one of the analogies from nature that is helpful to think about here is actually a flock of birds, if you will. I think we've all seen flocks of birds wheeling together in the sky, but scientists have actually shown that a flock of birds can respond to an external threat 3 times faster than an individual bird, 3 times faster. And that's what we're seeing in our communities that have that collaborative infrastructure in place, because they have those relationships, because they have those sensing mechanisms, know how to reach the populations that are most vulnerable. And I think that that's a really critical part of this. The other thing that we're seeing for communities that have those collaboratives in place, including the communities that Monique and Lori's networks include, is that there's the immediate response, right? How do we make sure that we get access to housing, to shelter, to healthcare, to food? But there's also that medium-term and long-term systemic response that we're seeing people working so hard on now, because the opportunity now is not to snap back to the systems that we had before, which are clearly broken. The opportunity is to reconstruct systems that get to equal outcomes for Black people and people of color in our communities. And that's the real opportunity ahead. And in order to do that, you need all the different partners in the community. I love Lori's depiction of community is the base. People that are closest to the problem also are closest to the solutions. And so having community leaders, community members, as well as employers in the business community, as well as government, and of course, nonprofit providers and partners, is really critical to getting to solutions and to reconstructing those systems. And then the last thing that I'll say just about your second question, Leanne, is one of the things that we've seen in terms of collaboratives that are able to get to systems change, right? That's really what we're trying to do, is shift these systems, are actually making that explicit as part of the work that they're doing. In other words, it's not just about the programmatic work. It's important to know what programs are working well, to do more of those programs, to link the programs together. That's, of course, critical to success. But the collaborators that we're seeing that are really successful at shifting systems are explicit about shifting systems, and that means that they are also shifting policy. I think Lori and Monique both spoke to that. They are also explicitly shifting power dynamics. They're lifting up the voices of community and shifting power dynamics, and they're shifting mental models and narratives as well, which are a really critical part of getting to systems change. They are also centering equity. Junius Williams, who is a great partner of ours on the Collective Impact Forum, wrote a wonderful blog around equity in collective impact, and I think the link went into the chat, so would encourage people to check that out. Vu Lei, who has this great nonprofit AF blog, has written extensively about equity in collective impact. And also our partners at PolicyLink, Michael McAfee and Angela Glover Blackwell, have also written some excellent pieces there if folks are interested in referencing those. But really holding equity at the center and focusing on systems change and the multiple aspects of the system we see as really critical to success.
Oh, thank you so much, Faye. And I think Lori wanted to chime in on your comments. So let me invite Lori back in.
Yes, very quickly. And actually, I was going to add in the piece about narrative change and the importance of how we sort of change the conversations that we've been having about these communities, moving from a deficit-based to an asset-based framework. But I think even a step further, and I think Monique was getting at this in her comments, the underscoring everything that we do with an understanding of history and knowing sort of that these systems were built intentionally and not by accident, because you have to be intentional in undoing them. And I think we as a society spend a lot of time turning our wheels with policies and this and that, but we never want to be comfortable enough to go back to the point in time these problems originated from. And I think what we have in front of us now is really this precipice where there's space to start to have those difficult conversations to say, hey, redlining is why this community looks like this. And that map still looks the same today. And how do we undo that? How do we undo this, and how do we improve this community if we can't have that conversation? And the last thing I'll say, and I think it's something that as Labs is trying to be very cognizant of, letting the community define what this model is for them, be it collective impact or something else, as long as it works. We've seen the same responses in terms of COVID and Black Lives Matter with having the ecosystem in place to respond. But I want to also just say that I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that these communities historically have always had the solutions. And if you go back again to history, you know that there were Black Panthers having soup kitchens, and there were all sorts of movements and organizing happening on the ground that our government intentionally and maybe in some instances unintentionally chose not to support and recognize. And so I think what we are looking to do now is how do we write that triangle so that the communities are not unstable, but stabilized, and that we move away from the rhetoric that says in order to sort of have economic mobility, that means you have to leave your community. The community can be stable and the community can be great and already is if we continue to invest in it and the people who are there.
All right, well, thank you for that build. Very, very insightful. I have a whole host of questions I could ask, but we also have a lot of questions from the audience, and this event is definitely for them as well. So let me turn to some of those questions. One question that came in from the registration: how do these community-driven collaborations address the intersectionality of poverty? We often address these issues in silos from one another: health, education, transportation, etc. But to a family, they're all connected. So how are we addressing it, and what roles can intermediaries play? And it's open to anybody.
I'm happy to dive in because
Thanks, Monique.
I talked specifically about intersectionality in my answer earlier, and that's what is so valuable about a cross-system, cross-sector collaborative approach is that, of course, rather than deciding that the problem is in education or the problem is in housing or the problem is with employers, communities are now, well, and to Lori's point and Faye's point, have always been coming together, but now with shared language, shared understanding, and shared measurement around how are all of these different systems intersecting in ways that are creating barriers to opportunity for the most vulnerable people in place. How has that always happened historically? How do we address these historical challenges? And how do we design solutions that intersect across all of these issues? So across our network, what we see are communities being able to bring the education system together with the post-secondary system, together with employers, able to use data on labor market research to figure out, okay, how can we actually create pathways at the local post-secondary education system that are going to help young people gain the requisite skills in order to be able to access not just these jobs, but to access career pathways that, as I mentioned earlier, will give them the opportunity to earn money while they learn and develop these skills, while also advancing in their careers. And at the same time, what intermediaries are able to do is say, but we know that young people need solutions to housing. We know that young people need solutions to transportation. We know that young people need childcare. We know that young people live in community with their families. And so we should be thinking about two-generation approaches, how we do this work with young people, but we will also do this work potentially with parents, or we might also do this work with their young children as well. So that in intermediaries that are able to hold this ecosystem frame, they're able to connect the myriad of systems together to design solutions that intersect across all of the barriers that young people face. Because young people will tell you they don't live single life issues. And in order to meaningfully show up for opportunities that come their way, they need to be supported by a range of approaches that come together across these different issues and intersect for solutions. So once again, as I'm mentioning, communities and intermediaries themselves are able to design multiple pathways, again, connecting secondary and post-secondary into careers, but they're also thinking about stabilization supports. They're also pivoting in real time to respond to COVID, for example. And this is very important because this is also tied to the comments that we heard earlier. They're also supporting the civic engagement, civic participation, and civic leadership of young people who say, yes, it's true. I'm now, going back to school, getting a post-secondary degree. I am making inroads into this career pathway. And I also care deeply about who's going to be elected into the the role of DA in my community, because I recognize that that ties to how me and my peers are intersecting with the justice system. So also activating and continuing to engage young people civically so that they can really lead on the vision they hold for themselves, for their families, and for their communities.
If I could tag on to what
Please.
Monique said, because I think it's a perfect segue into some parts of the labs approach, which is really looking at the work from the Urban Institute and looking at those three variables of economic mobility, power and autonomy, and dignity and inclusion and belonging, because I think that, we don't have the answer in terms of how we think those three things will actually work together, but we know that there is some sort of collaborative nature between those three things that communities need to have in place or want to have in place to be able to be effective as they pursue their own solutions. I think the other thing that I would say is that we at Mobility Labs we've had the opportunity to speak very closely with community, and we've had the opportunity to include them in the development of our theory of change. And so we've been very deliberate with how we collaborate with learning and evaluation, and how do you capture those three variables? How do you measure the impact that those variables have on a person's journey from poverty to economic mobility? And lastly, I'll say that I have within labs, we have a little approach that we use called the 3 S's, which is systems, self, and services. And it looks at sort of the fact that as we fund, we're funding direct services, we're funding systems change, but we're also looking at those 3 circles as representative of the self. And how do we invest across those 3 dynamics to make sure that problem solving, and I think Monique and Faye both echo the sentiment that the problem solving solutions that are being driven by the community are all inclusive and all encompassing, because there's no such thing as I'm poor just because I don't have affordable housing. I mean, there are, I hate to use the word comorbidities, but cofactors essentially that are at play that make the journey challenging.
Thank you so much. I think you have time for one more question, and this one too came in from the audience. And Faye, I'll turn it to you first to give you first crack at it. Partnerships can be a lot of work, especially at the community level. And there aren't many public or private funding opportunities and incentives to support these types of structural collaboratives. How do we ensure these community-led solutions are sustainable?
It's a really good question. And I think that that is part of why the collaborative structure is so important, right? Because if folks are engaged in constructing those solutions, they tend to be more engaged in funding them and sustaining them as well. And I would love to hear from Lori and Monique about the sort of the community piece. I think the one thing that I might add here, just from our Talent Rewire work, is the employer piece. We have found that employers are often the most difficult to engage in community collaboratives. And just a couple of things that we have found that work really well at engaging employers for that long term and helping to create sustainability in solutions from the sort of employer and private sector standpoint, I would say data and relationships. So first of all, data, I want to get back to Lori's excellent point about history and the history of community. Just a quick example, we're working in a large city, a workforce collaborative, talking about unemployment rates in that city. And we looked at the fact that this is pre-COVID, but unemployment rates were 14% for Black residents and 4% for white residents. And we went around the collaborative, and all the workforce and nonprofit partners said, of course we know that. This is the number that we live and breathe. This is what we work on every day. And when we asked the employers if they knew that data, they just looked at us blankly and shook their heads. They had no idea about the racial disparities or the history of redlining and sort of where that disparity played out. And we then looked at a map together of racial data, and we looked at where different populations lived in the city, and then we looked at where the jobs were. And of course, not surprisingly, the majority of jobs are located where white populations live. And one of the HR, human resources executives that was part of the Workforce Collaborative took that map and she put it on her wall in her office. And it inspired her to work with her own company, but also ultimately with the mayor's office to develop a new training program located in the Black neighborhoods that would then feed up to the major employers locally in the city. And that work's now moving ahead. It's a small example, but I think it just shows how important data is to sort of shift mindsets and to help employers to actually see the history and the data in their own communities, because they're not aware of that history in their own backyards. And then the other piece I would say is relationships. We know that data is not enough. Relationships are really critical. You have data to move the mind, but you have relationships to move the heart. And building those relationships within community and across the partners in community is really critical. So in our Talent Rewire Innovation Labs, we pay frontline workers to come and be essentially advisors to companies as they think about piloting changes in their own internal culture and policies. They often have not experienced those relationships before. These are often young people that have come through, participants in community-based organizations, graduates from some of these programs. They're incredibly impressive. And so when employers interact with these young people, they then want to go back and create partnerships with those CBOs and community organizations. And often they're not even aware that these CBOs exist and that these partnerships are possible. So building those relationships and really using both data and relationships to move heart and mind, we need those kinds of, we need that to engage all the partners for sustainability.
I love that. Move the heart and move the mind. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists, Lori Boozer, Faye Henley-Brown, Monique Miles. Incredible insights. I'm inspired. We really hope that this inspired all of you in the audience to think bigger, do more, and be bold. We'd ask you to, I challenge you actually to reflect on what's one thing that everyone joining this event could do this week to tilt the future towards social and economic inclusion for young adults. Thank you again. It's been an honor getting to know you ladies through this event, and thank you for all the great experience and ideas that you've shared. To keep things moving, I'd love to introduce now Roman Jackson, who is the Vice President of Partnership and Economic Opportunities at our very own Jobs First NYC. So Roman, if I can, I'm gonna hand the baton to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Leanne, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roman Jackson, the newest member of the Jobs First NYC team, and I'm excited to join this panel with partners from our community solutions work. Our community portfolio builds partnerships with key stakeholders in their respective neighborhoods to develop mechanisms to address systematic barriers, separating out of school, out of work young adults and their communities from economic advancement. This work is especially critical given the impacts of COVID-19 and the current movement for racial justice. I would like to invite leaders from each of our partnerships to briefly highlight their work, and then to follow up discussions to address some of the challenges and opportunities in building community-led collaboratives. I would like to first invite Brittany Bellinger, Program Manager of the Youth Design Center and lead partner of the Brownsville Mobility Labs, as our first presenter. Brittany?
Thank you so much, Roman. Good afternoon, everyone. So as a lead partner of Mobility Labs, I just want to get into where we are. We're probably the youngest partnership you'll hear about today. So the emerging partnership in Brownsville is supported by Robin Hood's Foundation's Mobility Labs and the JP Morgan Chase Foundation to spur the development of new solutions focused on lifting families out of poverty while driving the conversation around social and economic mobility. We happen to be a team of 5 with the support of Jobs First NYC. So you have the Community Board 16, which is an amazing organization that has created stakeholder groups and addresses the lack of collaborative work strategies within our community. You have the Brownsville Community Justice Center, which is another youth org, which the Youth Design Center works with a lot. They do lots of placemaking in Brownsville and work with court-involved youth. And then you have Central Brooklyn EDC, which has created a business incubator and also does a lot of workforce development in the community. And lastly, you have myself, part of the Youth Design Center team. The Youth Design Center is a youth creative agency and an innovation hub that trains young people in East Brooklyn in design and tech to create pathways for economic success and opportunities in the STEAM profession and field. And so together, we all are working on this partnership in order to address the needs of a community like Brownsville. So for anyone who hasn't been in a community like Brownsville, the last 10 years, we have engaged in multiple plans that have been developed by people outside of our community, and none of them have been fully implemented the way they were supposed to be or addressed, which has left our community very, very disheartened by it. So we have taken on this community engagement approach in order to develop these new solutions that are both data-driven and heart-led, so informed by our community. We've spent the last 9 months in planning, getting data from the community, engaging in once-a-month community meetings to try to get from the community what it is that they need to be successful in economic mobility. So first, I want to talk about what Robin Hood's definition of mobility was and how we have defined it ourselves in Brownsville. So from Robin Hood, mobility for the purposes of this initiative is defined as 3 components: economic success, agency, and belonging. So we hope to identify and measure indicators across all 3 components in order to create an initiative that will be funded multi-year so we can address these kind of issues that have come up from our community. In our very first community meeting, we decided to create our own definition of mobility with the residents of Brownsville. And this is where we are right now. This definition is what is grounding us in the work that we're doing and the proposal that we're creating. So our community definition: mobility in Brownsville means the people of Brownsville have equitable access to choices, opportunities, and resources, both financial and otherwise, that are driven by investment and collective community voice and with achievable steps towards self-sufficiency. Every single word that you read in this definition was carefully chosen by our residents because there's not just one thing, there's not just one answer to poverty. There's not just one answer to success in that. So as we have gotten deeper over the last 10 months, we have held different meetings, from youth meetings, we have had celebrations, we have had vision board parties, all to try to get all of the information we need to continue to do this work. And we got into these 3 solutions that we're doing a deeper dive into. One would be building wealth by increasing resident ownership and providing business support services. 2 would be increasing economic self-sufficiency by generating revenue as a community. And 3 would be increasing resident access to education, training, jobs, and financial resources. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Brittany. Our next presenter is Carrie A. McLean, Vice President of Community Development at WETCO and Steering Committee member at the Jerome Avenue Revitalization Collaboration. Oh, Carrie, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. It's so good to be here to tell you a little bit more about the Jerome Avenue Revitalization Collaborative in the Bronx and the glorious partners who you see on this page who have come together to form this collaborative in response to the rezoning that happened in the area. So let me tell you a little bit more. The JARC was formed with participation of different stakeholders, about 50 stakeholders, including community residents who were concerned about wanting to see inclusive growth and sustainability in the area. And if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about what was happening in the area. We really wanted to ensure that with the Jerome Avenue rezoning that was instituted by the city and passed in 2018, that local employers, local businesses, local workers would benefit. These land use changes that were effected as a result of the rezoning would result in displacement of businesses, displacement of workers, and we're really concerned as well about displacement of residents. So the JARC came together to ensure that the goals to prepare or create an employer-facing network would be developed, that there'd be a business hub to support businesses in the area in their efforts to have employers be connected to the resources that they need to thrive, and also that there would be an effort to focus on training resources for residents in the area who would otherwise not be able to afford the financial weight that it would take in order to get that training. So an employer-facing network, a business hub, and education and training were the three focal areas, and are the three focal areas of the JARC. As you can see on this map, this is the Jerome rezoning area. There are really great anchor institutions in the area, and it is a large geographic area. So that's one of the challenges actually of the JARC, is the large area that is covered by this. So this is a slide that just gives you an example of what the business landscape looks like. There are auto workers and auto businesses. There are retail and restaurants, all potentially at risk again. And so we wanted to ensure that there was this employment hub to really focus in workforce development, on economic development, and support to local businesses. As you can tell from this slide, there are actually already changes in property transactions, property transactions in the area. So there are lots of shifts that are happening, and our concern and our effort is really to try to connect with developers who are coming into the neighborhood, to find out from them what types of jobs they will have, how to refer candidates to these jobs, and to ensure that the economic gains that are made are not just going to leak back out of the community, but that residents in the neighborhood, job seekers in the neighborhood, as well as businesses will also be able to take advantage of those. One of the challenges, again, is that opportunities as well, is that there are a lot of people who live in the neighborhood who are working outside of the neighborhood in lower paying jobs, while they're good paying jobs in the neighborhood. So this JARC collaborative is enabling us to think together about how to center equity and economic opportunity for those who live in the neighborhood, so that they can also, as residents, take advantage of some of the wonderful paying opportunities that are local in the neighborhood too. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Our next presenter is Kelly Lobianco, Chief Program Officer at the HOPE Program and co-chair of Yes Bed-Stuy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Roman. As you just heard, my name is Kelly Lobianco. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the HOPE Program, also proud co-chair of Yes Bed-Stuy. Also happy to see Carrie on here. The HOPE Program and Sustainable South Bronx are also members of the JARC. So we're obviously very invested in community partnerships and in our work with Jobs First NYC. So Yes Bed-Stuy stands for Youth Employment Services Bed-Stuy. We're comprised of a dozen community-based organizations, education, workforce, social service providers, other community members who either are located in Bed-Stuy or are serving the youth of Bed-Stuy. And our partnership's mission, as you can see here, is to empower and pursue equity for all young adults in Bed-Stuy for long-term success in the workforce. We sort of developed this mission collaboratively with Youth Voice as well. And the HOPE program has been a member of Yes Bed-Stuy since its inception. I actually went to a Yes Bed-Stuy design meeting, the very second one, on my first day on the job in 2017. And so we're very committed and heard the call to action really loud and clear. And the call to action for this partnership is sort of displayed in this data that you can see on the previous slide, actually. It's a complex issue embodied in a very simple statistic. So with 2015 data, and we have a little bit better data now, but this is the data we had in 2017 and 2018, Bed-Stuy ranked second in the city for the highest out-of-school, out-of-work rate for young adults, 29%, or nearly 5,000 adults. And when Councilmember Cornegie, who represents the district, heard this statistic, he called Jobs First, wanted to get off this list. And that is really where the partnership was catalyzed and why all of us started to come together. And so speaking from my own organization's perspective, we were eager, and I think this represents a lot of our community that's come together, we were eager to be part of a place-based strategy that leverage the critical mass of partners and resources to meet a great local need and hopefully upend systems of inequity that have persisted for all time and are overdue for upending. And so we were looking at the progress and the success of partnerships you're going to hear from in a second, Lesson and Youth Wins, who were really moving the needle, enhancing individual organizations' efforts and achieving this long community impact. And so it's been 3 years of coming together, and I don't have time to go into sort of the full process, but we met monthly. We engaged young adults actively in our development and design, and came up with a service delivery model and goals and a unique value proposition that we're really excited to deploy and sort of are in position to formally launch this summer, although with some caveats because of our current crisis that you've heard a lot about on this call already. But quickly, some elements of our partnership. Number one, youth voice centered in our partnership design and services. That is key for us. Also a centralized, credible hub and community space for young adults to gain membership. This really came out in our conversations with youth. A dedicated staff to support assessment and customized plans for young adults to meet them where they are. That was really important. So not just referrals to training programs and education programs that we know our partnership does really well, but also lifting up youth voices through a youth leadership committee, developing professional development opportunities and things like that. So making sure that there's a variety of ways for folks to engage in this Yes Bed-Stuy community. And also an ability to celebrate wins towards financial stability and economic mobility. So the long-term engagement and community building. And lastly, thinking about the investments that are happening in Bed-Stuy, coming together as a collective to make sure that our pool of job opportunities that we're supporting young adults and connecting to encompass all sectors, and also the local investments in the neighborhood, and making sure that we're connecting folks for local hire. So, like I said, this is the model that we've sort of established with a goal of really reducing that 29%. The latest data is 21%, but we know the pandemic has caused a shift backwards. And so, we're actively responding in real time to what is happening on the ground, but also employing the principles that we've come together with over the last 3 years. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next presenter is Brian Licata, Membership Relations Manager of the Staten Island Chamber of Commerce and Chair Emeritus of Youth Wins.
Thank you so much, Roman. As Roman said, I'm from Youth Wins. Youth Wins has been around now for about 5 years. We are the Workforce Initiative Network of Staten Island. Youth Wins was initially developed about 5 years ago when the Staten Island Foundation approached Jobs First to address the out-of-school, out-of-work rate on Staten Island. As you heard from Marjorie earlier, initially Jobs First was contacted about 4 boroughs, but in New York there are actually 5. What we found was that on Staten Island, there were over 5,000 young adults ages 18 to 24 on the North Shore that were not in school and were not working. Right now, we're figuring that that number has probably either doubled or tripled due to COVID. With Jobs First coming out, what we did was we assembled a team of CBOs, government groups, private entities to address this issue. As everyone that's done partnership knows, in the beginning, you have a lot of people who come out. Everybody wants to see what's going on and see how they can participate. Over time, you lose some partners and then you gain some new partners. As of right now, Youth Wins has about 15 active partners, which are all trying to move this needle. But as we know, partnerships are very hard. There's a real cost to this work that we're not funded for. Organizations rely on the funding from their contracts, from city, state, federal, or even private groups. And these groups really have pitted us against each other, where our outcomes are based on how well we do with our recruitment over another agency. So building a partnership is usually built on the relationships with the individual people, not within the organizations that are part of that group. When a person leaves that organization, what we find is that the partnership also loses some of their cohesive. There's a person who's invested years into the partnership, and now we have to rebuild that relationship with the agency. I'm an anomaly. I went from one partner group to another partner group, so the collective knowledge that I had have been carried over. and both groups were able to retain the partnership inside of Youth Wins. What we decided to do inside of Youth Wins was we decided to set up a holistic approach. Early on, we realized that there was no way for us to address everything. So we decided to have wraparound services and support be the key. One group would pass an individual to another group, or that group would embed itself into that organization's contract. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lack of funding. We've actually fought for funding from our partners to make sure that we can get more funding or that we can utilize funding to the maximum. By putting our community over competition, we have been building trust with each other, which has then turned into transparency regarding our strengths and weaknesses. Our goal is to increase services that will better align the outcomes for our young adults on Staten Island. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And our last presenter is Gaspar Caro, Partnerships Director of the Lower East Side Employment Network.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jobs First NYC, for putting this event together and inviting me and the Lower East Side Employment Network to be represented on the panel. And also thank you to my fellow panelists and also to the attendees for taking the time out of your day to add another webinar, another Zoom session, to stare at your screen a little longer. Really appreciate you all coming in. And among you, there are some Lower East Side Employment Network staff who I want to thank as well. Some of you already left, which isn't a great sign for me, I think. But I still want to recognize Lisa Tamanelli, Matt Pfeiffer, and Carmen Lin. We lost Vicky Wong from the video, not from the actual presentation. So thank you to all of you. So Lower East Side Employment Network, we're a group of 8 organizations with social services in Lower Manhattan, including employment and workforce development. We are what Brian referenced, which is a collaborative instead of a competitive network. There is a healthy measure of competition, but really the premise is that our experienced workforce development agencies would come together with Community Board 3 to efficiently meet business hiring demand and support candidate supply in the neighborhoods of the East Village, Chinatown, Lower East Side, and Two Bridges. And it really came out of an explosion of economic development in the aughts, where developers, builders, new commercial operators saw cheap land, cheap office space, et cetera, and cheap bar and restaurant footprint in order to expand their businesses or start new ones in the community. And we kicked off pretty informally in 2006 and 2007, 3 leaders from the community board and 2 member organizations pretty serendipitously started talking and expanding their conversation to include what are now 5 of the 8 member organizations that started the network. So just to say a little bit about our approach, you know, it's not that we funnel all of the organization's access to employment opportunities through a central entity. Each agency, each organization still maintains its own roster of relationships with businesses and its own trainees and program participants. What is different and new is that they also have the option to share their relationships with the other members of the network. So it's really an optional collaboration to some degree, but in the end, it does wind up accelerating everybody's outcomes by about 10%. Above what they already were achieving. And there's different sized organizations among our network, and they see that return on their participation pretty equally close to that 10% figure. So thanks to Jobs First NYC, we were able to get some money to hire a coordinator, which was me. And some of the really important aspects of our design were regular conversations, a strategic review that created and formalized a lot of our operations, and the implementation of a major economic development partnership with Essex Crossing, formerly known as the Seward Park Urban Renewal Area. And it really took a lot of time to initiate, develop, operationalize, and sustain the collaboration. There had to be incentives and buy-in, and an existing or anticipated supply and demand for workforce development, that being candidates and businesses. So I'm pretty much out of time. I think I'm going to get the hook pretty soon. But I really did want to make the distinction that each neighborhood has the opportunity, or each community has the opportunity to do something like place-based. These images here are of the Lower East Side before the economic development really kicked off, and you wouldn't recognize it today. But really there are tremendous returns for partnership and pooling your resources. You can spark efficiencies, expansions, or other enhancements. You know, there's all kinds of partnerships historically, from industry groups to labor groups, health systems, and ultimately it winds up in making each element and each piece better. And I want to thank Lori and Monique for their comments about equity and intersectionality. I think that now more than ever, that is important during these COVID times. You know, there really is a need for large scale intervention and innovation, which in this sense might be childcare, healthcare, housing, and a few other, you know, food access, et cetera. And those are really where the innovations come in. So my hope is that the call to action for attendees will be to vote, complete your census, and encourage other people to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. Now I would like to invite you all back for the panel discussion. I definitely have a few questions for all of you, and I'll get started with my first question. However, we're also taking questions from the audience via a Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A tab. So my first question is, why is community-driven partnership so important? How have your partnerships incorporated community voice, and particularly youth voices?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yes.
Are you calling on us, or should I jump in?
No, Kelly, please jump in.
Sounds good.
I know you briefly addressed this during your presentation about how you got the youth involved. It would be great to kind of understand that process more, and also just talk about what you've learned during that process.
Great, thank you, Roman. And thanks to my fellow presenters. I love hearing from all of you, and also echo Gaspar's call to actions for the group. So why is community-driven partnership important? You know, I spoke a little bit about this a moment ago, but the way I really think about it is like the sum of our individual or organizational efforts are not always sufficient, appropriate, or sustainable to meet the great needs that are out there today. And we also talk about, and I heard it like multiple times on this call as well, like nothing about us without us. So really coming together with the community to make sure that we're not just reemploying the same tactics, the same strategies over and over again that have not upended, as I said before, the systems of inequity that are unmasked in incredible ways right now with the triple crises that Faye was talking about. That we really need to come together and build, upend the structures, build new infrastructures, and also take immediate action. And so I think we've been incorporating youth voice from the beginning. Jobs First worked with us in hosting youth focus groups. We have a youth leadership committee as part of our organization and partnership who meet regularly and give us feedback. We invite young adults to come to our monthly steering committee meetings and reflect with us as we, build our partnership from the ground up. And those voices have been critical in steering us away from, like I said, those standard tactics and strategies that haven't shaped the community in ways that the young adults are looking for. And then I would also just say, lastly, that I feel like I want to reiterate Gaspar's point, right? The major changes that have happened have come when community has come together, and we are looking at needs for massive systems change. And I think it can only happen if we continue to come together like this. So thank you.
May I also jump on that, Roman? Yeah, okay. So specifically for the community that I work in, which is Brownsville, Brooklyn, it is a community that I'm also from, that I have the privilege to work and be from the community. And like I mentioned briefly in my presentation, over the years, over the last decade, but even going further back, there have been many plans created by other people outside of the community, and none of them have addressed the needs of the community. And so part of what makes community-driven solutions important, specifically in our community, but really in any community, is the fact that in order to really make the change, you have to know what the issues are. And it's really hard to see everything from an objective or outside perspective. And so we have decided to take this opportunity that Robin Hood has graciously offered to, as local community partners on the ground, to actually make a community-driven approach. We're doing this work every day. These plans were popping up and being created, and we had no idea why we weren't being even included or included in the sessions, included in the work or the solutions, even though a lot of the local partners I met, including the community board, is on the ground every day with the people who need the support, allegedly that these plans were being built for. So that's the first thing I'll say. How we're addressing young people within that is through many ways. My organization is a youth organization. So we actually train young people in STEAM and we employ them. Young people have been a part of the planning and also the actual events. So we've hired young people to, for example, our alumni have helped to survey the community. They have helped to record and document the process. They have been included with their own meetings. We held a youth focused meeting. There was a scavenger hunt. It was all just for them so that they too can have a perspective, they can have a voice in what was happening, especially during this time. So at every point, the young people are involved, but also sorry about that. Also, we're trying to have a multi-generational approach as well. So young people, but also where our elders, they need just as much support. And so with every community event or approach, we're trying to figure out who is not in the room. Who is not in the room, so who is not being heard.
Thank you for sharing, Brittany and Kelly. Going to move on to the next question of how can partnerships create longitudinal programs, plans for community economic growth? And how can we connect the job market to local community development?
So Roman, I'd like to jump in on this. And I think one of the things is that we need hard data. We need to know what is coming down the pipeline. It's one thing to develop programs, but when we put young adults through job training programs and those jobs don't exist, we're doing a disservice to them. We really need to be boots on the ground to know what's going on in our communities, what's going to happen over the next 3 years, 5 years, and we need that youth voice piece that Brittany and Kelly were speaking about. You can't design a program for someone when they don't want to participate. You can't tell somebody what job they should have. You need to take that into that when you're designing the training programs and you're trying to find that right focus. So I really think that one of the hardest things over the last 5 years has been finding relevant data, because everything in New York City and New York State is so fragmented that we're only finding pieces of it.
And if I can add to that, I totally agree with the comment about data. Also, I think for any program for economic growth to be successful, it has to be cross-sectoral. And that's one of the beauties of the JARC, is that it includes businesses, it includes universities, or community colleges are part of the JARC steering committee. It includes the Chamber of Commerce, it includes economic development and social service agencies, it includes workforce providers, it includes a bank that has been a part of this process. It really has to be something that's also institutionalized and aligned with the mission of the organizations that are participating, so that it can get embedded within the partnership itself and also within the organizations that are coming together to have this happen. So I think a multi-sectoral approach, just to leverage the intersections across those different partners is really crucial. Of course, it's necessary for our legislators and for our agencies. We're so excited that we have community boards 4 and 5 as a part of this process in the Bronx, that they're advocating for the community with developers when they come before them, with different opportunities for investment that may come, that they're also thinking about the inextricable link between economic development and workforce development. You can't have one without the other. And definitely in our case, as in other cases across the city, where a rezoning is what, kind of like catalyzed our coming together, that puts businesses at risk, then that definitely puts employment at risk. So there really has to be a close look and an intentional look at not just adverse impact, but also economic opportunity.
Roman, if I can also maybe add some, similar to Jerome Avenue, Lower East Side was seeing a lot of rezoning and redevelopment in the aughts, and it used to be Seward Park Urban Renewal Area. Now Essex Crossing was the largest lot of city-owned land south of 125th Street prior to Hudson Yards, and it had been a blight in the neighborhood. Real scar used to be tenement buildings that were raised for the Lower Manhattan Expressway in the 60s. And it had been sitting vacant because there was very little community agreement about what to do with it. There were people who wanted affordable housing for the previous residents of tenements. There were others who didn't want it because they were homeowners or they were parts of co-ops whose money they were afraid of losing. And finally, in the end of the last decade, conversations really started coming together, and the Lower East Side Employment Network really helped drive the goal of connecting the local job market and labor market to the redevelopment of those city-owned lots. So I am confident in saying that a big reason why that development was able to hire so many community residents and make an impact with the individuals who live and work there is because of the Lower East Side Employment Network. We helped facilitate, to date, almost 500 hires at Essex Crossing. And that is a huge number. Historically, we've gotten around half of our outcomes with local residents. And I think it is fair to say that what it does is just really eases and smooths over the political relationships and dynamics that come into play in a neighborhood where organizations might be wanting to fight one another for access to the development, that instead, through a local hiring vehicle or a collaborative entity, they're able to work together in sharing information and sharing access to opportunities. That's really what these partnerships are, is a formalized relationship, a vehicle through which to share information and to provide opportunities to the stakeholders who may not have a seat at the table were it not for that entity.
All right, well, in my next question, and I think this is, of course, an important question just given what our world is facing right now. What does community organizing and building look like in a COVID world? How can we engage the community in conversations about our partnership design?
I guess I'll jump right in and start. Before COVID-19, Brownsville, I mean, just a few facts about Brownsville, is the highest concentration in New York City of public housing. It was already under-resourced, underserved. It has lots of vacant land. A lot of the ways that we communicate through our partnership with the Brownsville Mobility Labs team was through word of mouth. And then COVID-19 happened and it lowered our ability to knock on doors and do those kind of things. So we had to really kind of pivot and really address the urgent needs of the community. A lot of those things came into, we created something called the Brownsville Minute. So that became something we replaced our community meetings with for a while, because what we noticed from the feedback we were getting from young people in our sessions or from other spaces and residents were that no one knew what the truth was. There was no way to spread accurate information about the pandemic or about resources. Everybody was just, it was very scattered. There was no central area where you can see people that you trust and get the information help you pivot or survive. And so we decided to create something. We used the Community Board's Facebook Live platform, and we weekly, just all of a sudden, it was a very sharp turn, decided to bring on people virtually who the community already trusted so that we can get the information directly to the people that already trust the community board. So the first week there was 2,000 views. That's 2,000 people that may not have gotten to our Zoom community meeting or anything like that. Then the next thing is we started collaborating, getting into groups with other organizations like university, the the collective fair, anyone who was doing food justice work, because that is a big thing. In Brownsville, there was already a high need for food pantries and different food donations. So where are you going to get hot food? Where are you going to get groceries? Where are you going to get fresh food? We started linking all the gardens together, creating all of these things that needed to happen urgently. So it totally took us off the path of how we were developing our plan before. It shifted, but in a way that actually felt better for us and the community. And so for us, organizing looked like straight action. It was like immediate, where can I walk down the street and see something change? It also included us raising money personally from the Youth Design Center to start our own COVID relief funds for cash assistance. It included us going to Central Brooklyn EDC and having conversations about banking, because then you have to consider all of the barriers of poverty. So even if I give you money, how can you access it? If you can't go to the check cashing, if you can't do what you normally do, what are the ways that I am helping you get to the resources, especially in a time where there's less person-to-person interaction, and that's a lot of how our community survived. So that is basically what we have been doing. A lot of the community has been, really changed what our mission has been. They're like, right now, what we need, especially with the high levels of unemployment across the city, we need to know what happens to our jobs. There was already a limited access to jobs. And so that has become a really high point in our plan, which it was, but it wasn't as high as it is now. So it's kind of COVID illuminated the issues that were already happening, and it created new opportunities for digital, virtual, in-person community organizing that previously weren't really happening, or not in that way.
Thank you, Brittany. We're under the 10-minute mark. I'm going to ask a few questions from the registrants, but I just ask that we try to keep our answers brief. Just an alternative question, in a perfect world, how can government and policy support place-based collaboratives? And also, adding on to that, specifically here in New York, how can CUNY also support place-based collaboratives?
I mean, I'll be the one to say it. Workforce development. It is just something that we do not see here. And in fact, if we go backwards all the way to the 60s and 70s, half of the issues that we have is because New York has not correctly invested in our programs. Workforce development was drastically cut from this year's budget. Really, what we're looking at is, trying to run programs on shoestring budgets. Not only do we need federal infusion of money, we need state and we need city. Philanthropic would be fantastic, but we need something that's going to be here for a very long period of time. And without that money, it is really hard to run these programs and get livable wage jobs, not minimum wage jobs. And that has to be one of the biggest pushes that we have.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I would also add that a lot of the stakeholders, it's not just community organizations that are coming to these partnerships, but it is government and it is CUNY. And I think we're all coming together because the place-based issue that catalyzed our partnership are intersectional, as Lori and Monique were talking about earlier. And so we're trying to solve for intersectional challenges that promote equity in these neighborhoods and communities. And sort of, I think it's because the policies that exist right now are not intersectional.
All right. Another question from the audience. What solutions do we need to consider for young adults with disabilities?
I think they're intertwined in all of the work that we're doing. When we're looking at out of school, out of work, young adults and adults, we're looking at the entire spectrum of our populations. So I don't really think that they're on the sidelines. Most of the groups that are here today, we all work with the local TCAC offices. I saw a few of them on here doing shout outs earlier. We work with the DOE, District 79, District 75, We work with a lot of OPWDD. So I feel that that work is being done. Could it be done better? Of course, everything can always be done better. But I don't want there to be that illusion that youth with disability are not included in our work.
And I would just say to some points that were made earlier, it's about identifying who's not in the room and making sure their voices are elevated.
We have two more questions. What can we do to organize young adults so as to fight for a greater work power and thus better working conditions?
I think that young people are probably already doing a lot of this, and whoever asked that question, and myself included, don't know how they're doing it, because although I have a TikTok account, I have yet to post on it. But I have a sense that there's a lot of really rich and powerful activity in the background in a digital environment among young people. So I'm not sure that it's up to us, is I guess what I'm saying. It's probably more than anything, making sure that the young people have the basics and the foundations they need to be safe, well, and okay. And that might include broadband and a cell phone so that they can use TikTok and organize their communities and buy 1 million tickets to Trump's next rally, which hopefully only draws 3,000 attendees.
I would add that, many of our communities have like after school programs, teen programs, and just other ways in which young people are engaging. And so insofar as those programs can be really infused with context, with like history of the neighborhood. So young people are understanding the place where they live, from an historical context, including how inequity shows up in the community, and that it's not their fault, that there are systems, that there are, barriers, that there are things that precede them. That they, yes, with the tools that they have at their disposal, including TikTok, can be fighting for, can be channeling their energies toward fighting and advocating for their communities. So I think just infusing and embedding context and historical context more often than not, the Black and Brown communities that we work in is really crucial for young people to get a hold of and feel mobilized around.
All right, I have one more question for the panelists. What is the best first step for audience members to consider when advancing community solutions?
Going to the community. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to ask, is there a best step? Because if there is, I would love for somebody to tell me that. I really think what you have to do is you have to weigh what happens if you don't go to the community. By starting this work, you are really putting something into motion that can't be stopped. And whether it's how is this going to affect my job, how is it going to affect my career or my relationships with people, you have to put that on hold. And I think that the community has to be the #1 priority in this work.
Sorry. I just want to follow that up by saying, I'm not sure if this is the first step, but something that we have learned even as being 5 different partners in one community, where we all had different ways of doing something or different audiences we were catering to, even though we're all in Brownsville. I think that one of the things that we had to do was to, prioritize the community. And so that meant shifting times of meetings. That meant shifting locations. That meant thinking in ways that weren't just centering us, our organizational needs, our capacity. Sometimes it meant working harder. It meant working overtime. It meant thinking about, like I said earlier, who wasn't in the room. So I don't know if it's the first step, but it's definitely whatever you do first, the next thing should be like, what am I missing? Who am I missing? And how do I get there and access them in order to bring these alleged solutions that I'm creating to them? How can that happen without those people being in the room?
Yeah, I think it's really crucial to echo what somebody said before about just encouraging people to get civically engaged, whether it be through the census and voting. Like, we have local officials that represent us, and it's important for us to just recognize the influence that we have over them and the power that they have to shape our communities. And the more they hear from us as community members, then the more inclined they would be, we hope, to act and to, to legislate on our behalf. So I think an important first step or early step is for organizations and for community members to become civically engaged, and for organizations to encourage that civic engagement through different processes that we have.
Roman, we're almost out of time, but I do want to add something. And thank you to my co-panelists. And I think, just to build off of those points, right now, a lot of these questions and our responses feel, a little lackluster due to COVID. And I think that it will get a little bit clearer and easier. But, I think that we really need to admit our faults, our flaws, and our deficiencies. This might be the time for a glass half empty perspective. And I think that could go a long way. If we open more our communication, our information, we reveal how it is we operate, we put as much as we can on our websites to make the information public on who we're communicating with, who we're providing access to jobs for, et cetera, that will help aid in finding efficiencies and innovations that we will not come up with, but that the rest of society and our communities will come up with.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists for presenting your amazing work and joining us today. And I'm so excited to be working with you all towards this critical work that you're all doing. So I'd like to thank you all, and also like to welcome Marjorie Parker back to the stage. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you everyone who stayed with us. I hope that what you've heard today have really inspired you to want to do more, want to go back to your communities and said, we don't have a collaborative. We need to figure out how we build an infrastructure that will help us respond together to better solutions. It is my pleasure this morning or this afternoon to welcome a friend of mine, an innovative leader in the Bronx, Michael Pardis. Michael, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good. So Michael is the Executive Director for Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. And Michael, at JobSource, we've been advancing strategies around investing in community economics. And from our perspective, we're often thinking about how do you spark local economic growth? From our area of work as a part of improving economic conditions and the well-being of our communities, we think that investment must be made in local human services institutions to build multi-sector collaboratives to leverage resources and respond to local needs. From your perspective, community economics is around sparking local economic growth for local businesses, leveraging demands of anchor institutions, accessing supply chains, and supporting entrepreneurship. Exactly the work that you are leading at Bronx Cooperative Development Institute. Can you share with us, tell us a little bit more about BCDI and describe the work that you have on the way and the importance of economic democracy?
Thank you, Marjorie. I think you all will see on the next slide here. So the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, we're a community-led organization, and this is really important. One of the ideas around being a community-led organization was just taking a perspective that we've heard today already around, movement building and power building and starting, and no plan to be without the community, which was an excellent kind of point that we brought up today. For us, the founding really begins around specifically 2011, the Kingsbridge Armory. And at the Kingsbridge Armory, there was what we call a development struggle around two ideas. And the first idea was to turn it into a mall, and that happened during the Bloomberg era. And another idea around turning it into an ice skating rink with multi-use, that there was community benefits to bring it to do more things with it. And the history of struggles around planning, the history around struggles around economic development really led a number of CBOs and grassroots organizations. Well, one, what if the decision-making structure was changed? What if the decision-making structure was changed? And often this is something taken for social issues and for social political issues. But from an economic perspective, if the decisions on what was invested in, if the decisions on what money was spent in both finance and investment, if we changed the model, right, and more community decision-making was included, not just done with, not just done to, pardon, but done with, would we see a different kind of local economy? And so in 2011, it was a very simple question that was posed to us, that we posed, which was, what if we owned it? What if we controlled it? What would change? So part of that led to, and you see on the next slide here, part of what you saw was leaning into what we call economic democracy. And so one of the reasons why economic democracy is critical is that economic democracy fundamentally takes the democracy part seriously and incorporates it into our economy. And so the democracy piece is really around the people the closest to the result, right? That 1.5 million people that you see on the slide in front of you, that having those folks, people closest to the result, having them make the decisions around economic development and other types of workforce development. But I think the more important point was, if we think bigger around that, the Bronx GDP is almost $42 billion. Now, that was controlled. If that was controlled by 90% of the Bronxites of color, what would it look like? How different would it be? We even did in 2014, we did a procurement study, and there's almost $9 billion that flows out of the Bronx through anchor institutions. Only 1 to 3% of that actually goes to Bronx MWBEs. And so we began to say, in a simple way, what if the community had more decision-making? What if the community was more included? What if those regional economic perspectives were really closer to the ground? And so economic democracy for us is about a regional economy, right, that is resilient through the building of cooperatives, number one. And so these cooperatives are worker-owned social enterprises where we begin to develop the assets, financially speaking, we begin to develop the assets, we begin to localize anything from food systems to energy to advanced manufacturing. We begin to localize those supply chains. And when we localize them, we bring them into the cooperative model that then begins to have what is key here, shared wealth. So if we bridge these two things together, the democracy piece around how we make decisions and lessons learned from past planning and past economic development, and we include the model around cooperatives and worker-owned enterprise and social enterprise, and we begin to circulate wealth in a shared way, and we begin to circulate wealth in a way that stays with that 90% of Bronxites who are of color, and those 42 Bronxites who are born outside the United States, and that poverty, would we see a change? And so for us, the coming together of BCDI was around a response to what we've heard already today clearly around how do we get the people closest to the result to be the ones making the decisions and even bringing forth and developing the plans. And then how does that translate into the economy? Becomes clear that we have a tremendous opportunity here in the Bronx through the development of worker-owned cooperatives and other type of social enterprises to begin to take that $42 billion, begin to take that $9 billion that is in GDP and procurement, and to keep that home, right? To keep that in the birthplace of hip hop and salsa and the home of the largest cooperatively owned home housing development. How do we keep it here? Not in a way that silos it or isolates it, but allows to become a solution to multi-generational poverty. And so we see a Bronx that is full of worker-owned cooperatives, it's full of young people that own social enterprise and create social enterprise. And we hope that our approach, and we'll talk about it more in a second, we hope that our approach resolves the hopeful contradictions of our borough.
So Michael, in the pre-registration, we had a lot of questions around, what does your approach look like? What kind of models do you have on the ground? How do they work? Can you speak a little bit more about those models within the cooperative and what the approach look like on the ground?
So on the ground, one of the things here, we see the hopeful contradiction slide in front of us, but on the ground, there's a particular focus around what we call a community enterprise network that you'll see on the next slide here. And the community enterprise network really is an infrastructure model. We take an asset-based approach there are a number, and you heard our partners and friends at JARC, right? There's a number of community-based organizations, grassroots groups, nonprofits, historical nonprofits. There are already a number of folks doing the work. So what does the infrastructure look like, right, to allow the capacity of those organizations to grow? And even further, right, what does it look like to work with the existing businesses, the existing MWBEs, and minority-owned businesses in our neighborhoods? What does it look like to, yes, provide technical assistance, but what does it look like to go beyond that and to think about in an ecosystem? What are the supports that they need? You know, it's things beyond how do you manage your books, and it's things beyond, you know, the intricacies of e-commerce and the digital marketing. Those things are important, but how can we connect to the social issues in our neighborhoods? How do we connect to the human capital, right, that already is in existence that many of the CBOs and grassroots groups already work with? How do we bridge those things together? And so part of what you see on the slide in front of you with the what we call the Community Enterprise Network, what you see is a multi-sector and a multi-dimensional approach to build the infrastructure that responds to social economic issues. A planning vertical around how do we have community residents who are, again, closest to the result? How do we begin to make community plans and begin to advance those community plans? An innovation factory where we bring in young people and existing workers to think about advanced manufacturing, but to really make it with a community designed focus, right? How would the people who are actually dealing with health issues on the ground, how are the people who are actually dealing with critical issues around energy, what if you bring in their insights from the front lines into designing the equipment that we need to solve these problems? Even something like we've seen like accessibility, right? How will we design for that? And so our innovation factory looks at that. Popular education is very important. And so bringing together grassroots groups and thinking about how can we reimagine and narrative shift the Bronx to not see it as a place of deficits, but to, as we do, begin from an asset-based approach. And then lastly, you see here the Bronx Exchange, which is a strategy to redirect local procurement and really focus on small and medium-sized businesses owned by Bronx residents who are people of color. And what will it take to grow, in an economic model, to grow those businesses? And part of it is not just the back-end support, but how do we in the infrastructure supporting their development, everything from being able to connect them to RFPs, matchmaking, and overall just thinking about the opportunities that are there locally by continuing to localize our economy. And so for us, the model looks like a community enterprise network, like what you see in front of you, where we serve as the infrastructure to take the assets that exist in our neighborhoods. That includes our young people, that includes our existing small and medium-sized businesses, and that includes the CBOs that are already doing the work, that we bring them together. And if we think about it in an economic model, the supply side is full. The supply side is full, and it's about connecting to the opportunity, to the demand, and thinking about that multiplier effect. And those are the pieces that we are walking into.
Michael, thank you for that. Very interesting model. Certainly, I spent a lot of time looking at it recently. It is something that we'll talk about across our place-based network across the city. We have a question here that this locally focused solution, how important is it to reducing generational poverty in the Bronx and increasing economic mobility for young adults and their families?
So I think an on-the-ground example of this, we've been working intensely in integrated pest management. So integrated pest, formerly exterminators and that kind of colloquially. But when we talk about integrated pest management, I think COVID actually has really amplified the importance of this sort of work. And when we began the integrated pest management, one of the aspects of it that raised attention to us was actually and many of you know, Brownsville, Bronx, looking at the social determinants of health and just looking at asthma, chronic respiratory issues. Looking at those issues, we began to say, you know, in a business model, right, from a economic perspective, how could we address something that's socially determined, something that's happening? And so in IPM, what we did was, one, we thought about connecting workforce. So there are a number of young people who are in a number of workforce development programs. How could we bring young people into workforce, like IPM, for example? And when we think about the job placement part, how do we redesign that job placement? So are we looking for them to take that job training in integrated pest management and enter an existing business, or what would it look like if they entered it into a business ownership model immediately? So young people from throughout the Bronx and with our partner Northwest Bronx Clergy Coalition, young people went through an integrated pest management with two local integrated pest businesses, Black-owned businesses in the Bronx, Skedaddle and Kojo Pest Control. So young people working with the partner, working with those IPM businesses, Black-owned in the Bronx, Bronx residents began to connect to young people in workforce development, provide them the training, but then also create a ramp where those young people, when they finish, job placement is an option, but business ownership is also an option. And so thinking about it in that way, right? And you know, it's really been important in the COVID moment. I think that's a really important piece of how locally young people who are very obviously very familiar with the kind of challenges around health that their communities are facing are getting something tangible around the workforce piece, but are beginning to tie that workforce piece to a traditional job and beyond that. And I think for the vision of an economy that we want to have in the Bronx, that ownership piece is really critical and it's fundamental to economic democracy, that the people who live in of these communities begin to have ownership, not only decision making, but ownership. And so to be able to bring young people into that model has been really important for us and something that we're looking to scale up.
And Michael, question here is around what specific way, sector, and how else can you involve young people in economic democracy? So what specific ways or sectors around this cooperative model, and how can you involve young people more closely in economic democracy?
I think one of the ways to involve young people is really to tap into innovation and technology, and to have them tap into innovation and technology. And I think it's really important to move from the kind of tinker model, to begin to think about what is the equipment that we will need to confront the social challenges of our time. We have issues from the energy grid. We have issues around health and protective equipment that we need now. We have issues around health and actually access. We have civic issues around voting and around access to the ballot. And those are technological, those are innovation kind of questions. And so for us, as an example, we have the Bronx Innovation Factory, where we've been bringing in both youth and existing workers. We've been bringing them in to begin to take the community design and design thinking approach, but to begin to unpack that to say, in an advanced manufacturing model, with this makerspace, with this space that we have here, with this fab lab that we have here, what are the technological solutions, not just in software, but in hardware, right? What are the technological solutions that we need? And in fact, if we engage our young people, like we've been doing at the Bronx Innovation Factory, into the manufacturing conversation, now we're talking about something that will be very important to bring back to local communities. You know, again, COVID makes these things very clear, but bringing back that manufacturing, even in small spaces with young people utilizing technology and building equipment to solve the problems of their neighborhood, of existing workers to be able to solve the problems of their neighborhood, is very critical. And so our model has been to utilize the Innovation Factory and bring it through the Community Enterprise Network. But to begin, I think the question here is really critical that young people have the knowledge and the skill set to solve local problems. And it could be a return on investment, but it also could be social impact. We need to tap into that.
For your work that you are doing, we've seen a decline in the economic health of Black Americans and other people of color in terms of, especially in terms of owning businesses. I think I read someplace that in New York City that the Black-owned businesses have declined significantly. What's your, given the work that you are doing, and given that in America, one way of building health and wealth is really owning your own businesses, right? It's not just working for other folks. You know, what are you thinking, and what would you be saying to other communities as they look at the communities and see empty storefronts and businesses closing and lack of economic activity? What would you be telling them to do now?
I think number one, on the policy side, let's think about real estate and land use. This is a moment where, whether it's community land trust or some other model, we really need to think about the land that we use and land that that is available or will become available. So many of you, your community board will probably be the first place to begin to think about this. And in the Bronx, community board 5, 6, 1, 2, we could go on and on. That is a very critical sort of point. Think about how land is being used, because the access around land will be very critical for the kind of space that we need, for whether it's the innovation, whether it's businesses that are losing their storefront, but still are viable and they need a place to go, whether it's, I mean, and we probably will see this, community-based organizations that might face that kind of retail rent kind of crisis. We need to think about land use as important. And I'm at time really quick. The one other thing in terms of a local solution is, let's talk about community wealth building. And that's a playbook that has tremendous, you know, from the Democracy Collaborative to what we're doing locally in the Bronx. Community wealth building as a playbook is very important. And the very first step there would be, you know, not just to identify a cooperative or worker-owned enterprise that you can support, but to think about the space of bringing those worker-owned enterprises together. How can we support their viability by supporting their restructuring, their merging, and really helping them solidify? So it's not just to spend local, but it's to think very critically about how we spend local.
Thank you, Michael. Any last word?
The Bronx is still thriving. The narrative might be different, but the Bronx is thriving. We always invite people to come watch, look at these, look at the maker spaces, look at the innovation hubs, look at the work of our partners, the Point, Northwest Bronx. We can go on and on. Look at the work that's happening. You all are welcome.
Thank you, Michael, so much for joining us today. If you want to learn more about BCDI, please visit their website, bcdi.org. In the Bronx, we'll be sending out, sharing all the information Michael shared with you today. You can learn more about Michael and his organization. It's in the public. Finally, I want to thank you for staying with us for this 2 hours. I hope that what you've learned here today, that you'll be able to take back to your community. We're in a really tough time in our nation. We're really in a tough time across our neighborhoods. We're in a fight that it seems that we've always been in around racial and economic justice. Recently, Jobs First issued a public call around, you know, the need to invest more in economic justice, invest in economic security of young adults, invest in the financial security of the workers that are in the communities, their families, and invest in the community economics, some of which you heard Michael talk about today. We also, in some of our work moving ahead, we're going to focus some more in 2 areas that have come up a lot in our work. Brittany talked about in Brownsville that some of the organizations we work with focus on justice-related issues. Jobs First, over the next years, we're going to focus on the investment in community health and wellness, and also the investment in community safety and security. These are 2 key topics that have come up in all of our collaborative discussions over the year. We're the expert around workforce development. We're pretty good around building collaboratives, but we know and work with other partners who are experts and pretty good around building and working with local communities and finding solutions around wealth and health and wellness, and also around community safety. So thank you for staying with us. Thank you for following our work. Please visit our website. We'll be sending all of this information out to you. You can find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Go tweet at us your comments. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with us. We'll see you next time. Bye.